The lantern that shouldn't have been there. The first time I went into that cave, I promised myself I'd keep it simple, follow the map, make my notes, and get out before dark. I'd been cataloguing small cave systems around the Blue Ridge for a local geology group, and this one was marked as an easy limestone crawl, maybe 2 hours of steady work. I went in alone, as I usually did. Some people hate the idea of squeezing through rock with no one to pull them out, but to me, the solitude was part of it. There's a strange quiet underground, not empty quiet, but the kind where you can hear your own pulse in your ears. It can make you feel like the stone is listening. I'd been crawling for about an hour when my knees started feeling raw. The rock was fine-grained limestone, worn smooth in places, sharp in others, and the air had that damp, mineral tang I've always liked. My headlamp caught little glints of moisture along the walls. I stopped once to drink and check my map. According to the notes from the last surveyor, the crawl led to a wide chamber with no further passages, a dead end. I planned to photograph it and head back, but somewhere along the second hour, I saw something my map hadn't prepared me for. It was faint at first, just the tiniest flicker against the dark ahead. I thought it might be my headlamp reflecting off water, but the color was wrong. It was orange, a warm, steady kind of orange, like the flame of an oil lantern. It wasn't the sharp beam of a flashlight or the cold blue of a headlamp. It moved in a slow, almost swaying rhythm, like whoever held it was walking carefully through the dark. I froze. Nobody else was supposed to be down here. There was only one entrance, and I'd seen no sign of other vehicles outside. The air was too still for there to be a second opening. My first thought was that someone had slipped in behind me without me noticing, maybe a local who knew about the cave. I called out just a simple, "Hello!" My voice came back wrong, warped and muffled, as if the cave was swallowing it whole before it could echo back. The light didn't answer. It just kept swaying, the way it might if someone was walking deeper in. I started crawling toward it. Each time I moved forward, it seemed to slide a little further away, just enough to keep its distance. My gloves scraped on the stone, the sound louder than it should have been. The tunnel began narrowing until I had to keep one arm out in front and the other along my side. The light ahead pulled me on, the way a trail marker might when you're lost. I told myself I was just curious, that maybe there was a side passage the last survey had missed. But when I finally reached the end, I realized why it wasn't on the map. The tunnel floor simply ended. My headlamp lit the edge of a vertical shaft that dropped straight into blackness. I could feel the cool draft rising from it, carrying a smell like wet ash. The lantern, or whatever it was, hung there on the far side for a moment, steady now, no sway at all. Then it went out. For a long minute, I just knelt there, listening to the slow drip of water from somewhere below. I don't know how long I would have stayed if I hadn't heard the sound from behind me. A faint scrape in the crawl I'd just come through, the kind of sound you make when you drag your knee over rock. It was followed by another, and another. I turned, shining my light down the narrow passage, but it didn't reach far before the stone curved out of sight. The sound came again, closer now, but slower than any human crawl. I don't know how I knew, but it wasn't someone rushing toward me. It was something pacing itself, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I backed toward the shaft without meaning to. The thought of that drop was almost better than whatever was inching closer in the crawl space. The scraping stopped. Then I heard something softer, a slow, deliberate breath. It sounded almost like it was trying not to be heard. I called out again, quieter this time. My voice didn't carry, didn't echo, just faded into the rock. My light began to dim, and I realized with a sick feeling that I'd been down here longer than planned. My backup flashlight was in my pack, which was slung on my back, and the crawl behind me was the only way. to reach it. The breath came again, closer now. The air felt heavier, like the space between me and the sound was filling with something I couldn't see. I started backing into the narrow tunnel, moving slow so I wouldn't snag my pack. Every inch I gained made me feel like the rock was closing in tighter. When my glove brushed the stone ahead, I realized I'd come farther into this crawl than I'd thought. The way out felt longer. My knees were shaking now, every shift of weight making the sound of fabric against rock too loud in my ears. The breathing was steady, patient. I didn't run. You can't run in a crawl space. You can only move and hope you're faster than whatever else is moving toward you. At some point, I stopped hearing it, but I couldn't bring myself to stop and listen. When I finally saw the faint grey of daylight at the entrance, I pulled myself through so fast, I scraped my shoulder raw. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the slope to where my truck was parked. I went back the next week with a friend, but the chamber at the end was just as the map had shown. No drop, no swaying light, no smell of ash. Just smooth limestone and the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. I haven't been back a third time. 2. The breathing stone. We picked that cave because it was supposed to be easy, a dry system no more than a mile in, and wide enough that you could walk most of it without crouching. I'd been in tighter, wetter, riskier places, so this was meant to be one of those casual day trips you barely remember later. My cousin Jeremy had never done much caving before, so I figured this would be a good introduction. The plan was simple: head in before lunch, explore a bit, eat in the main chamber, and be back at the truck before the sun started dipping behind the ridge. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just a low, jagged crack in a slope of grey rock, half hidden by scrub pine. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, the warm summer air outside giving way to that constant underground cool. The light from our headlamps stretched out ahead, cutting through dust motes and catching the edges of old water stains on the walls. For the first 20 minutes, it was just the sound of our boots on dry stone and Jeremy making dumb jokes to hide his nerves. It started with the air. At first, I thought it was just the way a cave breathes, how temperature and pressure shifts make air move in and out, especially near an entrance. But this wasn't a draft. It was slow, steady, rhythmic. The air didn't rush past, it pushed. A gentle swell forward, then a slow pull back, like the tide. And it wasn't just the movement, it carried a sound. It wasn't wind, it was wet, deliberate, like a slow inhale pulled through a half-closed throat. The walls seemed to catch it, passing it down the tunnel in a way that made it feel both distant and right beside you. Jeremy froze the first time he heard it. We both stood there, listening. When we took a step, the inhale stopped. When we stopped, it started again. Jeremy laughed it off, saying it was just the shape of the passage playing tricks on the air. I wanted to believe that, but the sound wasn't random. It waited, it listened. Every time we moved, it went quiet, and every time we stood still, it returned. Like it had been holding its breath for us. About half a mile in, we reached a bend where the ceiling dropped low. We had to duck, our shoulders brushing damp stone. The air grew warmer there, and with the warmth came a smell, faint at first, like wet leaves rotting in a pile. It thickened as we stood in that spot, until it coated the back of my throat. Jeremy said we should turn around. I didn't argue. When we came back into the main passage, something was wrong. The tunnel sloped where it hadn't before, a shallow dip that I swore hadn't been there on the way in. The stone under our boots was damp now, slick enough that we had to watch our footing. The air swelled again. Push, pull, push, pull. But it was faster now, and I could feel it in my chest, as if it was breathing for me. I told Jeremy to keep moving. We passed one of the side alcoves I'd noticed earlier, except it wasn't just an alcove now. It was a narrow corridor angling deeper into the dark, the walls shining faintly like they'd been polished. I glanced inside for just a second, and I swear the floor moved. Not shifted, moved. A slow ripple like muscle under skin. We picked up the pace, but the tunnel seemed longer. The air's rhythm was quicker now, and it felt closer, like we were inside something alive. The stone itself had changed under my hand, warmer, soft enough to leave faint smears of damp grit on my glove. We stopped to catch our breath, and for a moment, the inhale matched us perfectly. I don't mean it matched our stillness. I mean it matched our lungs. Every time I drew in air, it drew in with me. When I exhaled, it exhaled. That was the moment I stopped thinking about geology or wind or caves. I didn't say anything to Jeremy because I didn't have the words for it. But I knew, deep down, the way you know when a shadow in the woods isn't just a shadow, that we weren't inside a hollow space. We were inside something. The floor pulsed once under my boot, just enough to make me stumble. We started running then, not caring about the slick stone or the narrow bends. My light caught something ahead, the faint outline of the entrance, and I locked onto it like it was the only real thing left. The smell was strong enough to make my eyes water now, and the air's push and pull was frantic, like it was trying to pull us back in. When we finally burst into daylight, the wind outside felt too thin, too cold, like I'd stepped out of warm water into the winter air. I looked back once, and the opening was just rock, no movement, no sound. We didn't talk much on the drive back. I don't think Jeremy's been in a cave since. I've been in dozens, but never that one again. Sometimes though, when I'm lying in bed and the house is still, I swear I can feel it again. That slow push and pull in the air, like something beneath the mountains is still breathing and waiting. Story 3. Footsteps in the Dripwater. I'd heard about that pool from 2 different people in Pike County, both of them swearing it had never once gone dry, not even in the heat of a drought summer. I figured it was the kind of backwoods exaggeration you hear about springs and wells, but I needed photos for a geology project, so it seemed like a good excuse to see it myself. I left early, the morning air still holding that thin mist that clings to the mountains, and hiked out to the entrance. The cave mouth was small and low, the kind you had to duck into, and the ground around it was littered with pale, broken bits of rock like old bones. Inside, it was cool and still. My headlamp lit the tunnel just far enough ahead that the walls disappeared into black. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and minerals, the way all shallow caves do. The tunnel sloped gently down until the ground evened out into a broad chamber, and that's where I saw it. The pool. It was maybe 20 feet across, perfectly round, the surface so still it looked solid. From somewhere above came a slow, steady drip, each drop sending faint ripples across the water. I unpacked my camera and tripod, taking my time with the setup. The place was dead silent except for that drip. Even my own breathing seemed too loud, so I slowed it, letting the cave settle around me. I just adjusted my lens when I heard it. Not a splash, but something heavier, like the thump of a boot heel in shallow water. Then another. I turned slowly, my light sweeping over the pool. Nothing moved, but the sound came again. A steady, deliberate wading, the kind you'd hear from someone walking through ankle-deep water. I tried to track it, but it wasn't coming from one spot. It shifted, circling, as if someone was moving around me in the dark just beyond my light's reach. When the sound grew louder, I stepped back toward the tunnel, keeping my light fixed on the pool. That's when I noticed the ripples, not from the drip above, but from every direction at once, spreading inward toward the center. My boot sank deeper than it should have into the damp ground, and I realized the water was rising. It didn't make sense. There was no source, no inflow, just the same dark stone walls I'd walked past minutes ago. The pool swelled over its edge, creeping toward my feet. My light caught something then, the faint, pale impression of a bare foot pressing into the water's surface, the toes curling down into the silt below. I didn't wait to see if another would appear. I yanked my tripod up, half folded it, and started backing into the tunnel. The sound of the steps followed me, slow, heavy, unhurried, even after the chamber fell out of sight. I could still hear the drip, but now it was buried under the steady slap of water against unseen legs. I didn't stop moving until I saw daylight again, sharp and blinding against the black behind me. I've been in caves since, deeper and darker than that one, but I've never gone back to Pike County. Still, sometimes when I'm near water, a riverbank, a flooded ditch after rain, I'll hear that same slow wading just under the surface, coming closer. Story 4. The tunnel that wasn't there. Yesterday I'd been working on that little cave system for weeks. It wasn't much to look at, nothing like the deeper, more complex ones farther into the mountains, but it had a few narrow passages, a couple of small chambers, and enough odd angles to make it worth mapping. The locals barely mentioned it, like it didn't have any stories tied to it, which was rare for this part of Appalachia. Most places underground have at least one old tale attached to them. This one was just there. I'd been through every part of it 3 times, so by my 4th weekend, I could have walked it blindfolded. Every bend, every jagged protrusion, every patch of damp mineral staining on the wall was familiar. That's why I stopped dead when I saw the slit in the rock. It was right along a stretch of wall I'd walked past a dozen times before, a dark, vertical crack barely wide enough for my shoulders. I told myself I must have missed it before. Maybe the angle of my light had just been wrong, but it didn't feel right. The edges of the opening were too smooth, like they'd been worked, and the space beyond wasn't a continuation of the rough limestone. The rock in there was darker, finer grained, and it had a faint sheen under my headlamp, almost like it had been polished by hands. The air was different too, in most caves. The air is cool and a little stale, but here it was warm, carrying the faint, dry smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, exactly. More like something burnt down to ash a long time ago, clinging to the walls. I slid my pack off and squeezed through, my boots scraping along the smooth floor. The passage beyond was narrower than I liked, barely allowing me to walk with my shoulders turned slightly. The farther I went, the more the air seemed to press in, thick and heavy, until it felt like breathing through cloth. My footsteps made almost no sound. After maybe 30 feet, the walls began closing in again. My light swept over them and caught something carved into the stone. Rough shapes, uneven and primitive. It took me a second to realize they were people. Each one was lying flat, hands crossed over their chests, the way you'd see someone laid out for burial. The figures had no faces, just the outline of bodies, dozens of them overlapping. Some were so worn I could barely make them out, but others looked fresh, the edges of the cuts still sharp. That was when I heard it. At first I thought it was the low whine of air moving through a tight space, but it was too steady, too deliberate. It was humming, slow, tuneless, but deep enough to feel in my chest. There were no words, just a constant rise and fall, like someone singing under their breath in another room. I turned to leave, but the slit I'd come through was gone. There was just smooth, unbroken rock where the opening should have been, my light catching nothing but that faint, polished gleam. I pressed my hand against it. It was warm, almost hot, and for a second I thought I felt the slightest vibration, like something moving deep inside. The humming grew louder, not from one direction but from all around me, seeping out of the stone. I backed away, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The air felt thicker now, and the smell of smoke was stronger, like a fire smoldering somewhere just out of sight. I don't know how long I stood there before I saw the light, a thin, wavering glow farther down the narrowing passage. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight, more like a candle flickering against the rock. I didn't want to go toward it, but with the entrance gone, I didn't have a choice. I started walking, my boots almost silent on the smooth stone. The humming followed me, steady and patient, until I realized it wasn't just sound anymore. It was moving through the air like breath, warm and damp against the back of my neck. When I finally reached the glow, I saw there was no candle. The light was coming from a patch of carvings on the wall, the figures etched there seeming to shift in the flicker. The ones nearest the glow had deeper lines, and I could swear their hands weren't crossed anymore. Their arms were out, reaching. The draft that came from behind me was warmer than before, and it carried with it a sound I can't forget. The slow scrape of bare feet on stone closing the distance. I turned back, and there was still no opening, just the smooth black rock, the humming, and the faint sound of someone breathing just out of sight. I don't remember finding my way out. I remember daylight and the taste of smoke in my mouth that didn't fade for days. When I went back the next weekend, the wall was solid, unbroken, the way it had always been. I never tried to go through it again. But sometimes when I'm underground, I'll catch that faint smell of smoke and hear that low humming in the stone, and I'll know it's still there, waiting for me to step close enough to see it. Story 5. The Voice Beneath the Water Table. We told ourselves we'd keep it simple, and by simple we meant stupid. No tanks, no suits, just snorkels, headlamps wrapped in plastic, and 100 feet of paracord tied off to a root above the pool. I'd read enough cautionary stories about sumps to know better, but this wasn't a proper sump, not the tight kind where people wedge themselves through coffee table cracks. This was a broad, low rock shelf in an old limestone system, a shallow creek with a rock lip you could duck under and come up in a pocket of air on the other side. Locals used to take children in here to cool off and scare them with ghost stories. I'd seen the videos online, teenagers with flashlights yelling to hear the echo. It was supposed to open into a chamber people called the mailbox, because according to the one guy who took a picture years back, it was just high enough to stick your head in and breathe. We drove out there after a dry week, guessing the water would be low, guessing the air quality would be fine because this wasn't deep, just a tucked away spot in the belly of the ridge. It looked harmless. Most bad places do. The slope down to the stream was a mess of slick leaves and loose limestone chips, all the color of cold dishwater. We parked the truck where the ruts dead-ended and carried our gear the last quarter mile. The entrance was nothing, a bite taken out of a low bluff, the creek curling into it like a dog disappearing under a porch. I could put my hand on the ceiling and feel the cool of the rock, water purling over my knuckles, the sound already quieter than it should have been. My friend Lane stood with his hands on his hips, weighing the plan as if there had ever really been a plan beyond try it. We checked our lights again and stuffed the extra flashlights into dry bags, clipped them to our belts, and stood in the water until our ankles went numb. The creek was shin deep in most places, knee deep in some, with silt that puffed up in a brown halo around every step. The paracord went around the base of a root twice, and we tied it off with a knot that would make a scoutmaster proud. Lane pulled on it like a tug-of-war rope. "If we lose this," he said, "we go home." We both nodded. I told him I wanted the first turn because I'd scouted like this was a thing people scouted. The shelf was right where the old directions said it would be, a smooth lip with just enough space to get your shoulders under. The creek went black beyond it. I lay flat, belly to rock, and dunked my face into the water. The cold folded me in half. It isn't the same cold as winter air. Water cold is an animal that climbs you. I took 2 breaths through the snorkel, tasted plastic and a hint of swamp, and I pushed off. The first second you go under anything solid is the worst second. Your body tries to lurch backward even as your arms pull you forward. The light on my head turned the silt into a shining cloud. I kicked twice, careful to keep my fins high so I wouldn't bury us both in mud, and slid under the lip. The shelf scratched the top of my tankless spine as I dragged through, and then there was space above me. I rose into it gratefully, nose and mouth above the waterline, blinking in the beam's scatter. The air pocket was taller than the videos made it seem. I could sit up with my shoulders out of the water. The ceiling was jagged, like broken black teeth. Water tapped a slow rhythm from somewhere I couldn't see. My light washed the walls, ragged and close, and my breath sounded too loud, like I'd stepped inside it. I turned to wave Lane through and saw him as a smear of light and shadow, a mouth where the creek came under, his arm lifting, 2 fingers up in a question. I gave him a thumbs up. He vanished under the shelf with the rope in hand. In the few seconds where I was alone, the air felt like it thickened around my head. Some caves feel clean, like a basement. Some feel used up. This felt used up, sour and damp in a way that stuck to the back of my tongue. When Lane popped up beside me, he ripped the snorkel out and spat. "Smells like a gut," he said. I didn't say it, but that was exactly it. The air tasted like something that once lived and didn't anymore. We both drifted in place, our shoulders bumping the rock, listening. The mailbox had the strangest acoustics I've ever felt. I don't even want to say heard, because it was more than hearing. My breath, Lane's breath, the drip, all of it doubled and came back late, like the sound had to climb down a long hallway and then remembered us. The water was low. I could see the line where it liked to sit in wet months. A scalloped stain a foot above my head. This should have made me feel better. It didn't. The lower the water, the thinner the air. I told myself that like a mantra and tried to slow my breathing anyway. Lane clicked his light to a narrow beam and scanned the far end. There was more shelf ahead, another low undercut that looked like you could duck again and see if there was another pocket. We hadn't planned to go beyond the mailbox, but plans change when curiosity rides you. Lane eased forward and dipped the light under the next lip. "Looks wide," he said, "maybe 3 feet of clearance." He sounded excited in the way people do when they haven't been scared yet. I offered to go first again, because the rope was already in my hand. He nodded and backed against the wall to give me space. My shoulder grazed a big tooth of rock as I slid back under. The water was colder here, or maybe that was panic I couldn't name yet. The silt rose in little suns under my light. I kept one hand on the ceiling, one hand pulling the line. Under the second lip, the passage widened, and for a second I stopped kicking, just letting myself drift. When you stop, the water presses even harder against your ears. I floated up into the next pocket and broke the surface, and right there I knew we'd made a mistake. The ceiling sat lower. The air was warmer and wrong. I pressed my palm to the rock behind me and felt it slick and sweating. Lane bumped up next to me, eyes wide and grinning despite it. He pulled his snorkel out again and said, too loud in the smallness, "You good?" I nodded, and it felt like lying. We sat there for a moment. We should have turned around then. It would have been the smart place to turn around. The only reason we didn't is because I saw, off to the right, a dark arch cut out of the waterline like a walkway where a stream had carved itself into the rock. I lifted my light higher. I wanted a photo of it, something to show the shape. That thought, the photo I wanted, is the thing I keep replaying. As if all I have to do is choose a different thought, and the next minute changes. When I brought the light up, the beam caught my face in the water, and my stomach did a neat flip. The reflection made me look like I was under someone else. It's a normal cave thing. Every light angle's a trick, but it made my throat close. I turned slightly, and the beam cut across the arch, showing the walls fanged with thin stalactites like icicles. I was about to lower it when I heard my name. I thought it was Lane at first, and I wanted to laugh at the way he'd said it, like a question, but he hadn't said it. He was right there next to me, mouth closed around the snorkel again, eyes on the arch. The voice came again, clearer. It was my name the way my mother says it when she thinks I'm asleep and she doesn't want to wake me, soft and right up against my ear. The water was to my right, the rock was to my left. There wasn't room for a third thing between us, and still, it sounded like the third thing had its mouth in my ear. I turned too fast and splashed myself and the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" I said, my voice sounding like a mistake heard from another room. "Hear what?" Lane said. He wasn't playing. His eyebrows were up in that way that means he's waiting to see if you're serious so he knows how to act. "My name," I said. Somebody said my name. He grimaced at me like I'd told a bad joke. "There's no one here but us." The voice said my name again, and this time it wasn't close. It was inside the syllables I use in my head when I think about it. Like someone had taken my voice apart for pieces and rebuilt it with a mismatch. If you've ever heard yourself on a recording and thought, "Do I really sound like that?" then you know a piece of the feeling. Put that feeling in a room you can't stand up in with half the oxygen you need, and it will make you small in a way your spine remembers. I told Lane we needed to go back. He nodded immediately. That was one of the good things about him. The way he'd say yes to retreat without making a contest of it. He turned and ducked under first, hand on the line, and for about 3 seconds I let out the air I didn't know I'd been holding. Then I went under, and the world narrowed to light and hands and the cold pulling at my throat. I've never been more careful than I was in the space of that turn. I kept my chin up to avoid flooding the snorkel, kept my hand flat on the ceiling to follow it, kept my other hand on the rope the way you'd keep it on a railing during a fall. The silt we'd kicked up coming in had thickened the water until it was milk, which meant the rope was our eyes. Lane's feet brushed my thigh once and I felt the jerk of him overcorrect. Then the rope went loose, then tight again. I heard the scream without the sound of my own brain yelling at me to kick, and I did, and the shelf grazed the back of my head like a hand pushing me along. I surfaced in the mailbox and tore the snorkel out and coughed. Lane was 2 feet away, white-faced, hair pasted to his forehead, blinking hard. That wild boy look people get when they've held their breath too long. We didn't say a word. We both took a breath and went for the last undercut, the one that would spit us back into the creek and air that hadn't been in someone else's lungs before ours. I had my hand on the shelf, ready to sink and slide, when something closed around my ankle. It wasn't a brush, it wasn't a fish, it was a hand, the shape of a hand, fingers curling into the notch above the heel and squeezing just enough to make my toes flare. It didn't try to pull, it simply held, as if to show me that it could. And when the water pressed close around my ear again, the voice said, soft as a lullaby, and so close it felt like my own throat had formed it, "Stay." Most bad choices aren't choices at all. They're things you do to keep from doing something worse. I kicked, hard, the way a child would kick when lifted off the ground. My heel connected with soft, then rock, and the grip slid off like a wet glove. I didn't look back. I shoved under the shelf and clawed forward on my elbows like I'd been shoved into a birth canal. The rope burned against my palm. The light rocked once, twice, and then I broke into the creek, into open enough space that I whooped and didn't care how thin and high the sound came out. Lane exploded beside me a heartbeat later, hand on my shoulder pushing, as if helping me was the only way to make the way out big enough for him too. We stood in the creek with the water at our knees, and I was sucking air like a landed fish. The silence back there changed. It had been thick and close and personal. Now it stepped back and watched us from the doorway. I kept waiting for a face to parcel itself out of shadow, for a hand to reach under again and finish the job. Nothing moved. The shelf was just rock. The creek just went. Sunlight laced itself through leaves as if we were in a world that didn't care what the other world did. We didn't untie the line so much as saw it loose with a pocket knife. My fingers wouldn't cooperate with knots. Lane kept saying, "Okay, okay," like he was talking to a spooked horse that was also us. I don't know how long it took to reach the truck. The trail ran a loop it hadn't run on the way in, and the loose chips slid under my boots in a way that made me think of going back under a thing I didn't want to go under. And then the tailgate was under my hands, and I was laughing and crying in the same shape of mouth. We didn't tell the story right afterward. Not at first. We left out the part where we went under again when we'd said we wouldn't. We left out the thinness and the smell and the way my name sounded in the water. We made it a funny story you can tell in a driveway at night, with the truck bed between you and the trees, and the wind carrying the laughter away so it won't stick to your house. Lane said we'd had a weird echo. I said I'd spooked myself, and we agreed not to go back in summer when the air sits like a dog on your chest. We said we'd pick a different creek next time. For a week, I tried to wear the story down with repetition until it would fit. What I kept, and what I didn't know how to say then, was the certainty that the voice wasn't someone else's. People get lost and call your name. Coyotes make a sound that sounds like children laughing until you want to punch a tree. Water can lie. But there's a way your own name sounds in your head. Not the part other people use, but the part you use when you talk to yourself and don't move your lips. I know that voice. I've lived with it long enough to know when it belongs to me and when it belongs to something that wanted me to mistake it for me. That's what pressed against me there. That's what lay on the other side of the rock, patient as a bed. I slept badly for a while, which is boring to say, because everybody sleeps badly after a scare. I woke at 2 or 3 and lay staring at the dark while the house ticked. When the air conditioner kicked on, I jerked like someone had put a hand on my shoulder. The sound of water came back as a memory that didn't need ears. The little thrum of an underwater current just before it shifts, the way a ripple folds and keeps a secret. I went to the sink for a drink one night and stood with the tap running and had to turn it off after a second because the sound of it moving through the pipes had the wrong softness. I started brushing my teeth with one ear unplugged so I could hear the click of the bristles instead of the swish of the water. I put my hand in the shower stream sometimes just to prove it was cold, clean, harmless, and I could do that thing where you cup the water and feel it climb your fingers in a way that's taut and simple and not meant to be understood. Twice, I dreamed about being back there. The first time, I was stuck between the 2 shelves. I could see the creek water like a strip of daylight under the last lip, and the strip didn't stay still. It picked up like a laugh and rolled backward. In the dream, I never reached it. I just kept kicking in place while the rope sawed my hand raw and my mouth filled with the taste of old pennies. The second time, there was no water, only floor. I lay on dry stone with my head turned and watched a handprint appear on my boot and press down until the leather squealed. I woke up with my foot burning and checked the boot in the closet like that would be the same as checking my skin. It took a month before Lane brought it up in a way that wasn't deflecting. We were in his garage. The door opened to the heat, drinking something light enough to pass for water. He said, quick, as if saying it fast would keep it small. "It said your name, didn't it?" I looked at him over the bottle. He rubbed the inside of his elbow with his thumb and said, "I heard, not the name but the shape of something, like a syllable catching. It wasn't mine." We didn't go back. Somehow that's the part I feel most defensive about, like there's a judge waiting to tell me that not going makes me a certain kind of coward. There are people who go back to prove a thing won't repeat itself, and there are people who admit they don't want to know the shape of the second time. We decided we were the second kind. Maybe a braver version of me goes back with a tank and a partner who does this for money, and a meter that tells you if your breath is thinning. Maybe that version comes out with a laugh and a video and a story about methane and echo and neurology. Maybe that's true somewhere. I'm not him. I'm the one who learned the word stay can be an invitation and a threat in the same mouth. Late that fall, after a rain that pulled the smell of leaves out of the ditches and laid it over the road, I drove by the creek without meaning to. The truck turned down the right gravel on a habit my hands had that I hadn't broken yet. I got out and walked to the drop-in just to see it. The water was higher, shoving itself into the entrance with a push and glitter it didn't have in summer. You wouldn't have crawled under that shelf then, not even as a dare. The sound was different too, louder and proud of itself. Standing there, it was easy to think we'd made it all up. It was easy to feel like the day had been nothing more than bad air and young stupidity, and the voice nothing more than my own throat echoing odd in a pocket of stone, and the hand my own calf muscle seizing in a way that a scared brain turned into fingers. I stood there for a long time, letting the easy version of the story build itself like scaffolding. I almost climbed it. Then the current stumbled. It was a small thing, a lurch on the surface where there should have been a smooth roll, and in that lurch was the shape of a breath trying to coordinate with something else's. I don't know that any other person would have heard it. I know I did. It was the same wrong softness I'd heard in the pipe at night, the same small, warm intent. A dead leaf went under the lip and didn't come back. The part of me that wanted to believe in the easy way put its hands in its pockets and said, "Fine." I turned around. I walked back to the truck. In the months after, the voice found new places to say my name. It said it when I knelt to check the crawl space and held my head under the ductwork to judge how much rust I was looking at. It said it when I leaned into the well house to listen to the pump hum and the pressure make the hose jump. It said it when I took a bath instead of a shower and closed my eyes and let the water cover my ears. And it didn't come across the surface to me then. It came through the water, which is a different kind of coming. Every time it happened, it was never a scream and never a hiss, always the same. My name like a remembering. There's nothing to do about a thing like that. You can't shout back at your own voice until it changes shape. You can only keep the house dry where you can. Lane moved a year later, 3 ridges over, where his wife wanted to be closer to her parents. We talk less. Not for any reason except the ones all friends have, the weight and muddle of days. The last time we fished together, he dropped his hand into the river absently and pulled it back with a curse because something cold found him that he hadn't expected. He looked at me over the ripple and laughed in the exact way he had in the truck bed that first afternoon. And I laughed too, because we needed the laugh to be a thing that was alive in the world and not something that lived under it. Sometimes I think about the line we cut loose and how it's probably still tied to that root, trailing like a vein into the dark. Sometimes I think about the other end of it, the part we left behind in the mailbox or beyond, and whether something curls it in its hand the way you toy with a string while you're waiting for someone to notice that you're still there. When the house goes quiet at night, quiet enough that the refrigerator motor in the next room sounds like a boat pulling up slow to a dock, I lie very still and listen for the word that isn't a word, the shape of the name that isn't a name, and I count my breaths, and I make sure they are mine. I keep my feet tucked in even when it's too hot for blankets, because I still remember how a hand felt on the bone above my heel and how it didn't ask. I remind myself that the worst of what happened was only a few seconds long. Then I remind myself that some seconds step down into your life and stand there like they paid for the space. People like endings. I know that. You want the story to tell you what was in the water, and whether it was ever anything at all. I could say it was bad air and nerves and the way caves throw voices, and for most people that would be enough. But there's a different kind of truth you carry in your skin. The shape of my name in that place was not the shape of a wind. The thing that held me wanted something simple, which might have been nothing more than for me not to leave, and it said it in the closest voice it could borrow. That's a small thing in a big world. It's not a monster, and it isn't a mystery that will ever step out into a light bright enough to take a picture of. It's just a presence, a wrongness in the warmth of the air over cold water, a whisper that turns the inside of your own head against you for a breath or two. I live with that just fine most days, and other days, at the sink with the tap open, I shut the water off quick when my name tries itself on, and I let the silence stand there between me and the dark parts of the house, and I wait until I can hear my own breathing again. That's how I know I'm still home. That's how I know I didn't stay. Story 6. The rope in the dark cave. Safety turns into superstition the deeper you go. You recite rules the way people used to whisper prayers, not because you expect the stone to listen, but because you're trying to keep your own head from turning strange. Don't go alone. Don't trust what you didn't set yourself. Don't push when you're tired. We broke the first rule by accident, and I broke the second one on purpose. And it's the kind of thing I still feel in my knuckles at night when the house is quiet and the heat pipe ticks like a drip. We'd gone in on a Saturday, early enough that the fog was still hanging low in the folds of the ridge. The entrance was a slot in sandstone. A mean little mouth, barely wider than my shoulders. You could smell old water before you even ducked. That mineral tang you get with these mountains, like wet pennies and leaves. My partner, Eli, had done a dozen trips with me, some worse than this on paper, but the paper never tells you where a foot will go wrong, or when a knee decides to misremember what it's for. He turned that knee under him in a sideways squeeze 20 minutes in. It wasn't a dramatic sound, just a short, mean pop, and then his breath coming fast through his teeth while he said, "I'm fine," like saying it could erase the noise we'd both heard. We sat there in the low red of the sandstone, my light carving a tunnel out of the dark, and his light pointed down like he was embarrassed to shine it. He tried to flex, winced, shook his head, and said the smart thing before I had to. "I'm going back," he said, not looking at me, which is how you say it when you're saving the other person from saying it for you. We went through the little routine you do to make it not feel like a retreat. I took his extra batteries and he took my spare tape so he could mark the squeezes. He insisted on leaving me the better first aid kit even after I told him that was stupid. "You'll need it more," he said, and I wanted to tell him that wasn't how need worked, but he'd already made a neat loop of the tape around his wrist. We set his pace back to the entrance, slow and ugly but steady, and at the last bend before the glow of daylight, he turned back in that halo and said, "Don't be long." I nodded, and he looked like he wanted to add a joke to make it lighter, and then the light behind him swallowed him up, and I was alone, and the cave took the sound like a dog takes a treat and holds it in its mouth. You tell yourself you're only going to finish the one map. That's what I told myself. We'd come for a side passage that hadn't been sketched right the last time, just a short runoff that twisted east and dipped toward a low shelf. It wasn't far. I'd get the measurements, take the photos, and then head out. and Eli would already be stretched out in the truck, kneecap propped with a jacket, pretending he hadn't been timing me. It was responsible enough to pass for sense if you didn't look too close. Sandstone does an odd thing to sound. In limestone, noise moves like a rumor, sly and quick, gathering stories. In sandstone, it's slower, heavier. Your own breath starts to feel private, like it's only for you. The crawl narrowed until the Velcro on my knee pads pulled grit out of the floor with a sound like tearing cloth. I counted my moves. That's another superstition. 12 elbows, 6 knees, 2 hands flat for the reach, and a wiggle. It's not that the numbers matter, it's that the counting keeps you the size you need to be. Big thoughts in a small space will break you. The shelf I was headed for was marked by a rust stain that looked like a hand dragged along the wall, 4 fingers and the heel of a palm. Up close, it was just the way water iron bleeds through stone, nothing shaped there but chance. I took the photo anyway because when you bring a picture home, people see what they want, and it makes it easier to talk around the parts you don't. The side passage opened a little, enough that I could crouch instead of belly crawl, and that's when I saw the rope. It came in low from the right, tied around a drive spike pounded into a seam with more conviction than care. The knot was a figure 8 that had been dressed with someone's patience. The rope itself was wrong in my hand before I even picked it up. It had weight to it, not the dead weight of too much grit, not the stiff weight of a muddy sheath, but a slick, living heaviness, like it had just come up from a bath and hadn't decided whether to dry yet. It wasn't dripping, but when I slid my glove along it, the glove shone. I held my fingers under my light. They were clean. It didn't smell like anything new. It smelled like the cave, which somehow made it worse. Cave safety says you never follow a rope unless you know who set it. You don't know where it goes, you don't know what it's tied to, and if you find a person at the end of it that you didn't expect, you won't have an answer ready for the question their shape asks. Every time I've told this story, I feel the need to give you a reason that makes me look more careful than I was. I don't have one. Curiosity is an animal that eats what you feed it. And I fed it with the idea that this was probably a survey line someone forgot to pull, that it would go 10 feet down a chimney and stop at a ledge with a paint mark and a smile. I clipped my cow's tail into the rope like I was in on the joke of my own hypocrisy, and I told myself I wasn't committing. The sandstone shaft angled, not a clean drop, more of a fat crack that pinched and opened as it tilted away under the shelf. I could keep my back to one wall and my feet to the other and walk it, using the rope as a handline instead of a lifeline. It would be fine. It was 30 feet. It was a story I could bring back to the truck without sounding like I'd chosen stupid on purpose. The first 5 feet were nothing. The next 5 reminded me that nothing becomes something when your boot squeaks where it should stick. I felt the shaft widen under me and the rope take on a different character in my palm, less like something left behind and more like something you meet. I shifted my weight and the rope did a small patient thing. It yielded. Not much, just enough to let me know it could hold me if I let it. The walls were damp where my shoulders touched. My light picked up mica fleck and made a galaxy out of it, and I hated the beauty for a second because it felt like being smiled at by the wrong person. At 10 feet, I paused like I was just gathering the next measurement, not admitting that my breath was already too loud. The rope ran downward at a gentle angle I didn't like it knew a way the rock wasn't showing me. I pinched the rope, and it pinched back with that same glossy cool. The thought came then, as clear as if someone else had pushed it into my head. This line's been in water, not condensation, not the kind of sweating stone does. Water that moves and holds and pulls a thing in and gives it back if and when it wants. You can tell water by the way it changes the skin of your tools. I wiped my glove on my thigh just to give my hand something to do, and the same shine stared back. There's a depth in these ridges where sand turns to the idea of mud without ever committing. That's where the shaft blew open. My right boot felt for the wall and found none. My left heel tried to wedge and slipped an inch. The rope put itself tight across my chest like a seat belt at the top of a hill. I glanced down and my light ran ahead of me and didn't see the bottom. It just kept going and then flickered on something that read as a presence rather than a shape. It swung slowly, not with the twitchy insistence of a bat or the bob of a hood, but a leisurely, almost content sway, as if it had its own calm. It took my brain a second to admit what my eyes were insisting on. It hung upside down, not head down like a person who's fallen and caught by their feet. Not the spiky clump of winter bats. A long, wrong silhouette, tapering where it should widen and widening where it should taper. Upside down and keeping time with the lazy pendulum the rope's weight made in the shaft. I told myself it was a trick of shadow, nothing more. That's the kind of lie you can say out loud to make the cave pretend to agree. I didn't say it out loud. I kept my teeth together and shifted my weight back the way you step back from a porch you thought had one more stair. That's when the rope moved against my hand. It didn't slip, it didn't run, it jerked once. A short, mean tug from below that traveled up the line and into the heel of my palm like a pulse you feel from someone else's body. If you've ever had a fish take a line and then let go, you know the exact measure of it. Every part of me wanted to go weightless with panic, which is the worst thing you can do when stone has you halfway held and gravity has the rest. I told my legs a story about strength and they listened a little. I put both feet back against the wall I couldn't see and found it again by faith and luck, and I pushed enough to get my shoulders to a pinch point. The shaft said no with a soft scrape and then yes with a harder one, and I rose 6 inches that felt like a floor. I stood there with my back grinding into rock and counted to 4 over and over instead of words. I kept waiting for the second jerk, because the second one is the one that tells you the first one wasn't a memory. It didn't come in that way. What came was a new sound that ate the edges of other sounds, the small hiss of something damp sliding over stone below me where my light wouldn't reach. I don't mean the water. Water is a constant kind of sound. This had intention in it, tiny as a mouse moving, patient as a hand trailing a wall in the dark to find a switch. I realized I had made the worst kind of promise to a situation. I'd clipped in. My cow's tail was short, just a safety, but it was an attachment that said if the rope moved, I moved with it. I got my right hand to the carabiner and fumbled in a way I don't usually fumble. Glove, gate, notch, twist. I could feel the grit in the hardware grinding like sugar between teeth. The biner stuck for a fraction and then slid open and my leash came free, and for a blank second I thought how quiet that is as a victory. That little snick, that sound in your skull and nowhere else. Coming up a shaft you've just come down feels like betrayal to your own body. The moves don't match, and the stone you trusted for descent decides to test your layout of faith on the way out. I jammed my knee into a corner that wasn't one and made it be one. I pressed my left foot to a ledge and told it was a ledge, and it agreed. The rope brushed my shoulder as if to remind me it was still there and would take me back down if I'd like, and I told it no with every muscle I own. My light shook, and that made the shape below shake too, and that made the part of my brain that wants to run through walls yell old words into new spaces, and the only thing that kept me from doing the worst possible thing, letting go and scrambling by panic, was the small mean memory of Eli's knee popping up near the entrance and how his face had looked when he said he was going back. It wasn't bravado that saved me. It was the face of a friend who expects to see you again. I rose. I can't make it prettier than that. Sometimes the win is just the direction. The shaft narrowed where my shoulders could take a bite of it, and I took a breath that turned into a noise I'm glad no one heard, and then the rope came alive again. Not the big jerk this time, a series of tiny plucks, like someone below had started testing it the way you test a line you're about to climb. I felt each one as a faint thrum in the glove, like radio static under the skin. With the third pluck, the rope slid an inch across my shoulder. With the fourth, it went slack and then taut, like whoever was below had either stepped up or been lifted. My light found nothing but an idea of motion revolving in a darkness that refused the gift of definition. Back at the lip, my right hand found the spike, and I put a kind of prayer into my fingers that I don't think I've said to anyone human. I come at belief sideways. I wasn't asking. I was just making a statement I hoped the rock would consider. The statement was, I belong up, not down. The rope made its opinion known by staying neutral, which was mercy enough for me. I hauled my torso over the shelf gracelessly, leaving a thin smear of mud and sweat, and what I hoped was the cave's damp, and not mine. On my elbows in the sandstone, I caught a breath that tasted like pennies again, and then I wasn't polite about it. I didn't ease the last foot like a good caver tries to. I pushed with anything that would push, and made the one undignified animal noise you make when you've decided dignity is for safe rooms with doors. In the crawl again, with the roof low enough that I could press my forehead to it and feel it cool and honest, I lay there for as long as it took for the shaking to be something I could use. The rope did one last thing that I think about more than the shape below. It gave a slow pull, not much more than the weight of a man standing and letting gravity take his share. It wasn't a call, it wasn't a taunt, it felt like a question you answer by leaving. I didn't cut it. Some part of me wanted to, the way you want to swing at something that scares you, but I didn't. Maybe there's a line between the kinds of wrong you make with a knife and the kinds you make with a retreat, and I picked the one I could live with. I unclipped what I'd clipped and left the rope tied to the spike exactly as I'd found it, because I didn't want to change a single decision in that space more than I already had. On the way out, I put a piece of tape on the wall with the date and 2 words, "Do not." It felt childish and necessary at the same time. I found Eli in the truck, as predicted, knee-wrapped with his bad bandana, staring through the windshield like he could see his way out of the next week of stiffness. He looked over when I opened the door, and he didn't ask the first question. He asked the second one. How long? I told him not long at all. He nodded like that meant something. Then he looked at my hands where the glove line ends and your wrist shows and said, "You're wet." I pressed my cuffs to my skin and it printed cool and clean. "Condensation," I lied, and he let me. The ride down the rutted road out of there was full of us making little jokes about how he would get out of work and how I'd have to carry the groceries for a while. And every time the truck hit a dip and the spare ropes in the back jounced and thumped against the bed, I could feel a sliding pull in my palm where there was no rope at all. I didn't sleep right for a handful of nights. It wasn't nightmares. It was the kind of alert that keeps small animals alive. Every creak in the house turned to a line under tension, and every soft clack of the baseboard expansion became a carabiner touching rock. I took the glove I'd used and washed it and set it on the porch rail to dry, and it didn't. Not for a full day, as if water takes its time letting go when it comes from the wrong place. 3 weeks later, when Eli's knee could manage stairs again, we went back for his pride if not for anything sensible. We told ourselves we were going to clean up our tape marks and take a few better photos for the club, which is the kind of lie that doesn't even pretend. We got to the side passage and the rust-stained hand was still there, and the shelf still smelled like old pennies, and the spike was gone. There was no scar in the seam where it had been. No little fresh spall where metal had bit and then been worked loose. The rope, obviously, wasn't there. I laughed, a small noisy thing that had more in it than humor. Eli looked at me in a way that asked if there was a joke he wasn't getting, and I shook my head like I'd decided something kind in his favor. We left. We didn't say we'd never go back. That's not how you close the door on a place. You just stop picking the day that would take you there. When I told the story later, in parts to people who know the difference between a good scare and a real one, a couple of them said things that were more comforting than true. Surveyors had been in. They'd cleaned old anchors. Floodwater takes gear and sets it down somewhere you can't see. You felt your own heartbeat in a nervous hand. Shadows are rude. All of that sits fine in daylight with coffee and maps. At 2 a.m, in the kind of silence that has a curve to it. What I remember most is the exact weight of the rope the moment before it moved. The patience in it. The way it waited to see whether I was going to prove myself as foolish as I'd already been. There was no malice in that tug. That's what bothers me. Malice would give you something to push against. This felt like an invitation to a thing the cave had decided to be for a while, and I was almost the shape it needed for that. I think about that upside-down sway and how some things hang in their own time, and how you only glimpse them when you make yourself smaller in a place that prefers you smaller. I keep telling myself I broke the second rule because the first one had already been broken and I was trying to salvage the day. It's bad math, and I know it. These days, when I tie into anything, even a clean white line I pulled from its bag myself, I take an extra second and run the rope through my palm and ask myself if it feels indifferent. If it does, I trust it. If it feels like it remembers something, I don't. That's the superstition I earned. In the grocery store, when a pallet strap snaps in the next aisle and makes that flat whip sound, my shoulder jumps before my head can tell it to calm down. I sleep with my hand under the cold side of the pillow more than I used to, because the weight there is a version of a thing I can choose and unchoose. On wet mornings, the slick of humidity on the porch rail can make my palm think about shine, and I wipe it off with an old towel like I'm erasing a decision. It doesn't work, not entirely, but it gives my fingers a task. And that's sometimes enough to keep the bigger thoughts from trying to stand up in a room where they don't fit. People want the end of the story to be a lesson that makes them better cavers or smarter versions of themselves. I don't have that for you. I have a rope that moved once, in a way that told me it had been held somewhere I didn't want to be, and a shape that swung in the dark upside down, and the knowledge that leaving was not a hero's choice, but the only one that would let me keep telling it. If that's thin for you, you're lucky. For me, it's exactly the thickness of the air in a sandstone crawl, and that's as much as I'm ever going to have. Story 7. The collapse that kept whispering. I went into the old shaft because I'd run out of excuses not to. My uncle had worked this seam before I was born, and he always called it the place the mountain ate me once and spit me out meaner. He warned me off every hole in these hills, but I wanted photographs of the mineral veins for a project. I told myself that was the only reason. The first 100 feet stayed man-made, square and low, rotting ties underfoot, rails half buried in mud, the smell of damp. Iron. I passed the last wooden cribbing and felt the air change, the way it does when a mine opens into natural stone. My light picked out the cavern I'd heard about but never seen. Dark ore streaks in sandstone, ceiling dripping slow. I'd just framed a shot when I felt, more than heard, the ridge shift overhead. A deep grind rolled through the floor into my boots, followed by the sharper sound of rock slipping. Dust sifted down, and somewhere behind me, a timber gave way. I didn't run. You don't in places like this. Instead, I spotted a narrow gap in the wall and slid inside, pulling my pack behind me. The collapse roared, stone hammering stone until it should have been over, but the noise didn't stop. It softened, became a hiss, then something wetter, like someone whispering through a mouthful of grit. I froze. Every time I shifted forward, the whisper followed, keeping a half-second delay, as if listening first. The seam led to a small chamber, smooth floor, old candle stubs in a niche, boot hollows in the dust, all pointed toward a black slot in the wall. The whisper pressed into that slot and came back muted, almost close enough to warm my ear. I said, "No," out loud, just to break the air. My own voice sounded wrong, chewed before I heard it. I backed into an older crawl I knew would connect to the main drift. The sound moved with me, not echoing, but tracing me, like my movement pulled it along. Once, I thought I heard my name, but not the way people say it, more like the way you hear it in your head when you're half asleep. The crawl was tight and wet. Dust and grit pattered on my back. I counted breaths, refused to stop until I reached a bend that let me sit up. The whisper pooled at my knees, then slid to my shoulder when I moved again. It felt less like pursuit and more like the stone was memorizing me. Finally, the air cooled ahead, and I felt the faint thread of a draft. I told the whisper, "I'm leaving." It went still for 3 beats, then murmured something too soft to catch. I pushed through one last squeeze and dropped into a timbered drift I recognized. The daylight at the far end was a pale square that never looked better. I didn't look back when I stepped into the wind, but I touched the rock and said, "Thank you," the way my uncle did. I tell myself it was just sound carrying strangely in damp stone. But sometimes, in my basement, I'll pause mid-step and feel the air shift, and I'll hear the shape of speech without words, waiting for me to move so it can follow.